Hi there, I'm Jen. This is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of some February reading that I don't think I've talked about elsewhere, and maybe a January one as well. This is Kenko's A Cup of Sake Beneath the Cherry Trees. This author was a medieval Japanese monk who is mostly meditating on meditation, essentially, and some of it is a little lecture-y, like, I went to China and people were more minimalistic there. People in Japan should pay attention to that, be minimalists, which is a little funny reading now, because minimalism is so popular, and who knew that they were still talking about that back in the 1300s? And they were. He says a few things that are a little misogynistic, like women are there to tempt you. It's like, maybe relax, sir. This was an interesting read in that I haven't read any medieval Japanese Buddhist monks commentary before, but it is not something that made me want to go out and read more of this author's writing, which is, I think, what these tiny Penguin Little Black Classics collections are normally for. So it was successful in the sense that I enjoyed it, or was at least interested in it as I was reading it, but it did not encourage me to go and read more of this kind of thing. I felt like, all right, I've gotten a taste of it, and that was enough for me. I also read a couple of short nonfiction works by James Baldwin because these were available now at the library, I think because of Black History Month. The first was The Devil Finds Work, which is a collection of film criticism, most of which is criticism of American films that are specifically looking at both what the portrayals of race within the films has meant for general American race relations, what the various casting decisions have made. He talks a lot about Sidney Poitier's various roles. He talks about Birth of the Nation. The only one that is really talking about something that's beyond an American black-white lens is Lawrence of Arabia. And I thought his commentary on that was a little odd. I didn't feel like the politics worked. It didn't seem to merge with the rest of it quite as well. But interestingly, that is the one movie of the ones that he talked about that I've actually watched and watched more than once. Most of the stuff he was talking about were films that I was familiar with or had seen bits and pieces of, but hadn't actually watched in their entirety. So it was interesting if you are a film buff, or if you are interested in the ways in which pop culture reflects society's ideas about race, specifically from an American lens, from the way it would have looked at a point in the early 70s. I definitely recommend this. The second book from him that I read was No Name in the Street, which is essentially three pieces. One is about his relationship to various civil rights leaders, many of whom were later assassinated, and about the culture around that, about being in association with people, about the way in which some people would view him suspiciously as being someone who aims their voice towards a white audience, which is not necessarily how he saw himself, but he has an understanding of why people viewed him that way, and what that meant when he also had these close relationships to civil rights leaders. In the second part, he talks about a kind of before and after during the periods in which he was living in Paris, before and after the Algerian War, where he is having his attention drawn to the fact that the structural racism and the direction of the police brutality and also the general social prejudices are just different in France than they are in the United States, but not in a way that's better, just in a way that's people are still being murdered on the street, but it's different people. And being kind of startled in that, having been raised with the very specific American prejudice that goes from dark to light exclusively, that he's startled to discover that there's this middle ground and that it's possible to be Senegalese and be treated better than an Algerian, because from an American lens, he is expecting the Algerian to be better treated because he's fairer skinned than the average Senegalese, and this is not how it is there. And he talks about some Italian tourists that were murdered by the French police during that because, oh, they might have been Algerians, who knows, and that kind of thing. And how startling that is to be so used to the American framework and to go, this is horrible too, it's just aimed differently. So I think that's really interesting, seeing Americans trying to work their way through traditional or structural prejudices work in different countries, and both how it overlaps and doesn't with the American, I'm going to say tradition, but that's not an ideal way to, I mean, maybe it essentially is, right? The third section is, speaking about structural racism and whatnot, is about a friend of his who was clearly framed for murder and at the time of the writing was still in prison, and this whole fight that he was going through himself and his publishers, and they couldn't even help this friend of his, and they were powerful people, including powerful white people, and it didn't seem to matter that being up against the whole framework that is designed to keep people down, essentially. And in a lot of ways, that is the most depressing of all of the essays in here because it is still so current. This is the same discussion that we continue to have today. And you can read essays from American writers who are alive today writing exactly the same thing. And it is quite depressing to think that we are this many decades later and the conversation has not changed. And the discussions of police brutality and the general injustice and all of that is still the same. Which I think is frustrating, but also important to read so that people don't have the impression that it's a new conversation. I also listened to 2 audiobooks, one of which was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which is partially a Holocaust memoir and partially an introduction to his specific brand of psychoanalysis or psychotherapy. It was a lot of psychobabble for me, but I am very cynical about that kind of thing. But it is definitely interesting. I was reading it kind of in the context of some friends of mine are going through you can't say this is the worst thing that can happen to someone, but I think this is one of the worst things that can happen to people as a parent and as an aunt in the case of my friends. And I did not find this especially useful in terms of how to approach their specific situation, but I think there are a lot of specifics that aren't mine to share, so I'm not going to talk about that. But because I was reading it through that framework, I don't think my commentary is going to be super useful, so I'll link to Christy from Dostoevsky in Space, because I think she has more interesting commentary that is not through this very specific and personally depressing lens that I was reading it through. But I am going to comment that if you are picking that up, I would not pick up the audiobook because it's read by somebody with that real, almost received pronunciation accent, and then when he does accents for other people, it's a little iffy, so I didn't love that. So I would recommend reading it and not listening to it if you are able to, if that's an option for you. And finally, I listened to a celebrity memoir, and that was Over the Top, A Raw Journey to Self-Love by Jonathan Van Ness, who's the hairstylist on the new Queer Eye. This is one of those celebrity memoirs where it's clear that he didn't use a ghostwriter, and maybe he should have, or at least had a co-writer. It is sloppy. Because it's the audiobook, you get his personality, and that helps somewhat. I think this would be, I don't want to say unpleasant, because there's a lot of good stuff in here. He is very open and honest about how harsh society can be to people who are gender nonconforming and who are HIV positive, and he talks about that in a kind of inspirational way. This also was unusual in celebrity memoirs in that I usually find them more entertaining before they get to the part where they get famous, whereas this I thought was more interesting after he was working kind of peripherally in the entertainment industry, and I think because it was peripheral, that was a little more intriguing than they usually are. But this genuinely was far too long for what it was. The audiobook, I think, was about 7 hours long. It could have been 4. It has a lot of fluff on it that if there'd been a co-writer, I think some of that would have been cut out. There's a section where he includes an entire grade 6 essay, and I don't need to hear that. He also does this thing when he uses fake names for people. He uses just fake Slavic names, which I found really weird. I always feel like if you give somebody a fake name, it should have the flavor of their own name, and it was just odd to me that because sometimes you'd be listening to this and he's saying Dimitri said so-and-so, and then I went, yeah, that's probably a fake name, but maybe not. And I appreciate that he grew up somewhere in the US Midwest, so he associates all of these names exclusively with figure skating and gymnastics. But if you actually grew up with any people who have actual Slavic names, like not just Russian names, but like Ukrainian names and Balkan names, like they're real names that people have. It's not like a joke name. So I found that a little distracting. In any case, I think if you're going to pick this up, the audio is the way to go, but it needed an editor. And which is a shame, because as I said, he deals with some serious issues, and he has a very entertaining voice when it comes to celebrity memoirs, and it was just way too long for what it was. And very repetitive. Like, I understand, you're very close to your mother, that's good. You don't need to keep telling me. In any case, if you're a big fan of his, it's probably still worth picking up, but yeah, it was too long for my taste. I also read a piece of graphic journalism called Guantanamo Voices, True Accounts from the World's Most Infamous Prison. This is written by Sarah Mirk and drawn by various illustrators. The way this was created was Mirk interviewed various people, prisoners, guards, journalists, lawyers, various people who had some connection to this prison camp at Guantanamo Bay. And each person's interview is presented as a separate chapter with illustrations by these different illustrators. If you know anything about what was happening and about what Guantanamo Bay was used for, you know this is brutal. It is such a horror show, not just in that people were being tortured there, but that all of this was designed specifically to be outside of the law and outside of international law, and intentionally, so that these violations could happen and no one could do anything. And it would be that difficult for lawyers to come in, for Human Rights Watch people to come in and whatnot. So it is devastating to read in that sense. And I do certainly recommend it on that basis, especially if you haven't read anything else about it. If you have, this is certainly a good supplemental piece, but it might not be essential. And I think it is successful in getting across that sense of horror, not just in terms of the specific abuses, but in terms of the infrastructure that was built so that the abuses could happen, because that, I think, is almost more horrific, the planning that had to go into that. However, because there are different artists on each interview, there is a kind of inconsistency to that, because the different angles that they're taking, while some of it does reflect the voices that we're hearing from the specific interviewees, a lot of that does come down to the style of the artist as well. And so it does make it feel somewhat inconsistent, and I did feel like, at least for me personally, having a more consistent style, even if it wasn't all by the same artist or by a single artist just playing with styles for the different interviewees, I think that might have been a stronger package. I do think this is still very worthwhile, worth picking up, but I did think the lack of consistency was a bit of a flaw, but certainly not one that takes away from the overall value of this. And finally, something, we're gonna flip back to something lighter. I read a graphic memoir, and that was Lucy Knisley's Displacement, a Travelogue. She is known for her other graphic memoir. Relish, the food memoir, I think is her best known. This book follows her when she was in her late 20s and accompanied her grandparents, her grandfather who was physically declining and her grandmother who was suffering from dementia, signed themselves up for this cruise but weren't in the state that they could go on their own. And her father and uncle were maybe in denial of how much help they actually needed, but ultimately supported her in going along with them as a caretaker. And so this story deals with both the caretaking role and how she gradually discovers that they need significantly more care than she had originally expected and that her family had set her up to expect, but also deals with her getting to know more her grandparents as people in this stage where they have changed, and especially in the grandmother's case, where her entire personality is probably not what it was once. And as she tells the story, she goes through a memoir that her grandfather had written of his experience during the Second World War, which she shares bits and pieces of a little bit unevenly. There are some parts where she comments on what he said but doesn't actually show it, and then other times she shows us things that are from the memoir which aren't necessarily the more interesting ones that she's just mentioned and doesn't actually quote. Because I was specifically curious about some of those parts, I found that a little disappointing. But I did think this was an interesting portrait of caretaking, because I think a lot of these caretaker portraits are about people dealing with their parents or dealing with their partners, and less often of it skipping a generation, essentially, like this, with the grandchild taking care of their grandparents, without having the father and uncle part of this story, at least at a level that's helpful. There are bits where she's calling them to see, can you get them a direct flight instead of this connecting flight? And they are not doing it, maybe because it's difficult, maybe because it's expensive, and maybe just because they're in denial about how much their parents' health has declined, whereas she's having it face on, but because it's her grandparents and not her parents, it's maybe somewhat easier for her to deal with. So I did think that was interesting. Is it as good as, say, Roz Chast's Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant? No, that's kind of the masterpiece of this elderly relatives in decline memoir. This was still worth the read if you enjoy is not the right word maybe, but if elderly caretaking memoirs are something you're interested in, I did think this was not a bad one, especially because, as I said, the bigger age gap made it unique amongst this style of story, I thought. All right, I think that's all I'm going to talk about now. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought. That's it for now. Ciao.